Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The baby monitor.
When we first moved into the house, I couldn't have been more excited. It was the perfect place to start our little family. A cozy two-story home nestled in a quiet suburb of Seattle, with just the right amount of charm and character. It felt like the kind of place where we could make countless memories, and I was eager to begin our new life here with my husband, David, and our newborn daughter, Lily. Setting up Lily's nursery was my top priority. I wanted it to be perfect, every detail just right for our little girl. The room was painted a soft, calming shade of lavender, with white furniture that gave it a fresh, airy feel. I spent hours arranging and rearranging her crib, the changing table, and a plush rocking chair where I'd spend late nights soothing her back to sleep. One of the last things I installed was the baby monitor. David had insisted we get the best one on the market, a sleek, high-tech device that promised crystal-clear video and sound. I had to admit, it gave me peace of mind knowing I could keep an eye on Lily at all times, even when I wasn't in the room. The monitor was equipped with a night vision feature, motion detection, and even a two-way audio system that allowed me to speak to her from anywhere in the house. The first night we used it, I sat in the living room with the monitor perched on the coffee table in front of me. The screen displayed a perfect view of Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib. I watched her chest rise and fall with each tiny breath, feeling a wave of love and protectiveness wash over me. This was my new life, watching over my daughter, ensuring her safety and happiness. I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment, knowing I could see her every move, even from a distance. As I stared at the screen, mesmerized by the serene image of Lily in her crib, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Everything was as it should be. Our new home, our beautiful daughter, and this powerful little device that let me keep her in my sight at all times. I couldn't imagine anything disturbing the peace of our perfect little world. But as I would soon learn, some things are meant to remain unseen. It started subtly, so much so that I almost didn't notice it at first. A few nights after setting up the monitor, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something strange. It was just a faint noise, barely audible, but enough to jolt me awake. I sat up, listening intently, trying to pinpoint what it was. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the baby monitor on my nightstand. I leaned over to check the monitor. The screen showed Lily, still fast asleep in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling rhythmically. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again, a faint whisper, so quiet that I thought I might be imagining it. I stared at the monitor, straining to hear, but the sound had stopped. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a trick of the mind, and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was downstairs in the living room, with the monitor on the coffee table in front of me. I was reading a book, trying to unwind, when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. The screen flickered for a split second, showing a brief, distorted image. It was too quick to make out, just a flash of static, but it left me feeling uneasy. I dismissed it as a glitch. Maybe the monitor was picking up interference from a nearby device, or the Wi-Fi was acting up. But then I heard the whisper again, this time a bit louder, like someone was murmuring just out of earshot. I froze, staring at the monitor. The screen was back to normal, showing Lily sound asleep, completely unaware of anything unusual. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, just technical issues that would probably resolve themselves. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper, faint but persistent, and the memory of that fleeting, distorted image lingered in my mind. The next few nights were the same, flickers of static on the monitor, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and an unsettling sense of unease that I couldn't explain. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it. I started paying closer attention to the monitor, watching it more intently, waiting for something to happen. And the more I watched, the more I noticed. The whispers became more frequent, the flickers of static more pronounced. Sometimes, the image on the screen would warp and twist, as if something was interfering with the signal. But every time I checked on Lily, she was perfectly fine, sleeping soundly in her crib. I wanted to believe it was just a technical issue, that there was a simple explanation for everything I was seeing and hearing. But as the days went by, I found it harder and harder to ignore the gnawing feeling of dread that had taken root in my chest. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what it was. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have known that something was wrong. But at first, I kept convincing myself that it was all in my head, that the monitor was just acting up. It was easier to believe that than to face the alternative, that there might be something else in the house with us. The disturbances didn't just continue, they got worse. The flickers on the monitor became more frequent, the whispers louder, clearer. And then, one night, I saw it. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, with the monitor propped up on the counter. I glanced at it absent-mindedly, expecting to see Lily peacefully sleeping as usual. But instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadowy figure on the screen, just barely visible in the dim glow of the night vision. It was tall, almost skeletal, and it was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward Lily's crib. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. The figure seemed to hover over her, its shape shifting and blurring as if it was made of smoke. I rushed up the stairs, my mind racing with fear. When I burst into Lily's room, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. But when I looked at her crib, there was nothing there, no figure, no shadow. Just Lily, sound asleep, completely unaware of the terror I was feeling. I checked the room thoroughly, but there was nothing out of place, nothing to explain what I had seen. I went back to the monitor, hoping that maybe I had just imagined it, that the figure was some kind of glitch or trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That figure, whatever it was, had been real. I could feel it. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next night, the shadow returned. This time, it appeared earlier, while I was still downstairs. I saw it move across the monitor, slow and deliberate, like it was aware that I was watching. The whispers were no longer faint. They were clearer now, and unmistakably human. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was dark, almost threatening. I felt a growing sense of dread every time I turned on the monitor. The shadowy figure would appear more frequently, lingering near Lily's crib, sometimes even hovering directly over her. Each time, I would rush upstairs, only to find her alone, sleeping soundly. It didn't make any sense. How could something so real on the screen vanish without a trace? The images on the monitor became more distorted, more disturbing. Sometimes, it looked like there were multiple figures in the room, their shapes merging and separating like some twisted dance. Other times, the screen would flicker violently, the image twisting into grotesque shapes that made me feel sick to my stomach. I could feel myself unraveling. The more I saw, the more paranoid I became. I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if I was losing my mind. How could this be happening? Was it some kind of sick prank? Or was there really something in the house, something beyond my understanding? Every night, I would sit in front of that monitor, waiting for the shadows to appear, dreading the moment they did. I became obsessed, unable to think about anything else. I could barely sleep, barely eat. All I could do was watch, and wait, and fear for my daughter's safety. But the worst part was the growing sense of helplessness. No matter how many times I checked, no matter how much I watched, I couldn't stop it. The shadowy figure kept coming back, and I was powerless to do anything about it. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, and I didn't know how much more I could take. I couldn't take it anymore. The shadowy figures, the whispers, the growing dread, they were driving me to the brink of madness. I knew I had to do something, anything, to figure out what was happening in my house. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly terrified, feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. I needed answers. So, I decided to dig deeper. I started by researching the house's history. At first, I found nothing unusual, just the typical records of a home that had changed hands a few times over the years. But then, I stumbled upon an old article from the local newspaper, dated over a decade ago. The headline sent a shiver down my spine. Child mysteriously vanishes from local home. Search continues for missing boy. The article described how a little boy, just 3 years old, had disappeared from his bedroom one night, without a trace. The parents had been devastated, and despite an exhaustive search by the police and the community, the boy was never found. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of foul play. He had simply vanished. And the house where it happened, it was ours. My heart pounded as I read the details, my mind racing to make sense of it all. The boy's name was Ethan. His parents, the previous owners of the house, had moved away shortly after his disappearance, unable to bear the grief and the lingering questions. The case had gone cold, and the house had changed hands a couple of times since then, but no one had stayed long. I wondered if they, too, had experienced something they couldn't explain. I dug further, combing through old news articles, police reports, anything I could find. The more I read, the more disturbing the story became. There were rumors, whispered among the locals, that the house was cursed. People claimed to have seen strange things, shadows in the windows, strange noises at night, objects moving on their own. Some even believed that Ethan's spirit still lingered in the house, trapped between worlds, searching for a way to come back. The whispers on the monitor, the shadowy figures. Could it be Ethan? Was he trying to communicate, to tell me something? Or was it something darker, something more sinister, pretending to be him? I was terrified, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know the truth, even if it meant facing the unthinkable. I began to look through old records, trying to trace the house's history even further back. That's when I found it, a record of a family that had lived in the house over a century ago. They, too, had lost a child under mysterious circumstances. A little girl who had disappeared one night, never to be seen again. My hands trembled as I pieced it all together. This house, my house, had a dark, tragic history, one that seemed to repeat itself every few decades. Each time, a child had vanished, leaving behind only unanswered questions and broken families. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the horrifying truth. Whatever was happening now, whatever I was seeing on that monitor, it was connected to these past events. The shadows, the whispers, they weren't just random occurrences. They were echoes of something that had happened before, something that had claimed the lives of innocent children. And now, it was happening again. I felt sick to my stomach, a cold dread settling over me as I stared at the monitor, at the image of Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib. I knew I had to do something, but what? How could I protect her from something I didn't even understand? One thing was certain, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront whatever was haunting this house, whatever was trying to reach out to me through the monitor. My daughter's life depended on it. But as I prepared myself for what was to come, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was up against something far more powerful and terrifying than I could ever have imagined. I knew this was my last chance. The fear had consumed me, but my love for Lily was stronger. I couldn't let whatever was haunting this house take her from me. I had to confront it, to fight back, no matter what it took. So, I devised a plan, a desperate, last-ditch effort to protect my daughter and reclaim our home. I spent the day setting up cameras in every room, every hallway, even the basement. I didn't trust the baby monitor anymore. It had become a window into something I could barely comprehend. Instead, I wanted to see everything, to capture whatever was lurking in the shadows. I had to know what I was dealing with. As night fell, I put Lily to bed, my heart heavy with fear. I watched her sleep for a long time, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face and whispering a promise that I would keep her safe. Then, I retreated to the living room, where I had all the camera feeds displayed on my laptop. The monitor sat beside it, like a ticking time bomb I was too afraid to touch. The hours passed slowly. Midnight came and went, and for a while, everything was quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the electronics and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I felt the tension in my body build, every nerve on edge, waiting for something to happen. And then, it did. The first sign was a flicker on the monitor, a flash of static that made my heart skip a beat. I leaned forward, staring at the screen as the shadowy figure appeared once again. But this time, it didn't stay in Lily's room. It moved, slowly, deliberately, out of her door and into the hallway. I watched in horror as it crept toward the stairs, its form twisting and shifting like smoke. I quickly checked the camera feeds, my hands shaking. The figure was there, too, barely visible but unmistakable, moving closer to where I was. The whispers started again, louder this time, almost like chanting, a dark, guttural sound that filled me with dread. I knew I couldn't run. Whatever this thing was, it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. I had to face it, to confront it head-on. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was trying to smother me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it. The figure was at the bottom, a dark mass of shadow and smoke, its form barely human. It looked up at me, and for the first time, I felt its presence in a way that was almost tangible, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to reach into my soul. The whispers grew louder, more intense, filling my mind with a sense of overwhelming despair. But I couldn't back down. I had to protect Lily. I took a step forward, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the empty house. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to rise, its shape growing larger, more defined. It was no longer just a shadow. I could see features now, twisted, distorted, as if the thing had once been human but had lost its form over time. Its eyes, or what passed for them, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to draw the light out of the room. And then, I heard it, a voice, clearer than before, emerging from the whispers. "Give back," it rasped, the words barely more than a hiss. Give back. What was taken? I realized then what it meant. The children, the ones who had disappeared from this house, they had been taken by this thing, trapped in some nightmarish limbo. And now, it wanted Lily. It wanted to take her, too, to keep her in its twisted grasp. "No," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "You can't have her. You can't take her." The entity surged forward, and the house seemed to come alive with it. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. I could feel its anger, its desperation, as it tried to push me back, to force me to give in. But I stood my ground, refusing to let it win. In a moment of sheer terror, I pointed the flashlight directly at the figure. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating its ghastly form. It recoiled, its shape distorting and writhing in the light. The whispers turned into a furious roar, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with anger and sorrow. I didn't know what else to do, so I kept the light trained on it, hoping that it would be enough to drive it back. The figure seemed to shrink, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. But just as I thought it might disappear, it surged forward one last time, its form coalescing into something more solid, more real. I braced myself, ready to fight, but then the monitor, forgotten on the floor behind me, came to life with a burst of static. The entity hesitated, its attention drawn to the screen. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something, an image, a face, trapped within the static. And then I understood. The entity wasn't just haunting the house, it was trapped within the monitor, bound to it, unable to escape. It had been trying to reach out, to find a way back, but it was stuck, caught in the loop of that cursed device. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the monitor and hurled it down the stairs. It shattered against the floor, the screen going dark with a final burst of static. The entity let out a terrible, inhuman scream, a sound that echoed through the house and rattled the walls. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The house fell silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. I collapsed on the floor, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. It was over. Whatever that thing had been, whatever had haunted this house for so long, it was finally gone. I rushed back to Lily's room, my heart pounding with relief. She was still asleep, safe and sound, completely unaware of the nightmare that had just ended. I picked her up, holding her close, and whispered a promise that I would never let anything harm her again. The next day, we left the house. I didn't care about selling it, about the money we had invested. All I cared about was getting my family far away from that place, from the horrors it had held. We moved in with David's parents while we figured out what to do next. I don't know what became of the house after we left. Part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know this. Some places are haunted, not just by spirits, but by the echoes of past tragedies, by the darkness that lingers long after the events have faded into history. And sometimes, that darkness finds a way to reach out, to try and take something for itself. I'm just grateful that this time, it didn't succeed.
The Silent Neighbor.
Moving to Portland felt like the fresh start I desperately needed. I had spent months searching for the perfect place, and when I finally found this apartment, it felt like fate. It was a cozy one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood, just a few blocks from the bustling city center. The moment I stepped inside, I knew it was right for me. The hardwood floors, the quaint little kitchen, and the large windows that let in just the right amount of sunlight, it was everything I had hoped for. Unpacking didn't take long. I'd always been somewhat of a minimalist, and besides, I was eager to settle in. As I set up my new life, I couldn't help but appreciate the silence around me. It was as if the world outside didn't exist, and I was in my own little bubble. No honking cars, no loud neighbors, just peace. Speaking of neighbors, there was one I couldn't help but notice right away. Mr. Grayson lived in the apartment next door. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a graying beard and a stern expression that made him seem unapproachable. The first time I saw him, he was coming out of his apartment just as I was struggling with a box. He didn't say a word, just gave me a curt nod before heading down the hall. I remember thinking it was strange how quiet his apartment was. Living in such close quarters, you'd expect to hear something. Footsteps, a TV, maybe even some muffled conversations. But there was nothing. Not a single sound came from his unit. At first, I found it comforting. After all, I had moved here to escape the chaos of my previous living situation. The last thing I wanted was a noisy neighbor. But as the days went by, the silence started to feel strange. It wasn't just that I didn't hear Mr. Grayson. It was that I never heard anything at all from his apartment. No doors opening or closing, no movement, no signs of life. It was as if the place was empty, even though I knew he was in there. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe he was just the quiet type, or maybe he spent most of his time out. Besides, I had more important things to focus on, like starting my new job and getting used to the city. Still, there was something about that silence that I couldn't quite shake. It lingered in the back of my mind, a tiny seed of unease that I couldn't explain. But for now, I pushed it aside. I had a new home, a new life, and I wasn't going to let a little oddity spoil that. At least, that's what I told myself. A few weeks had passed since I moved in, and I was finally starting to feel at home. My job was going well, and I had begun to explore the city, discovering new coffee shops and parks to unwind in. Life was falling into a comfortable rhythm, but something about Mr. Grayson's apartment still gnawed at me. It wasn't anything specific at first, just little things that didn't add up. I noticed that I never really saw Mr. Grayson. In fact, the only time I caught a glimpse of him was that first day when he gave me that terse nod. Since then, his apartment door was always slightly ajar, as if he had just stepped out or was about to return any second. But he never did, at least not when I was around. There were no signs of life coming from his place. No footsteps, no sound of dishes clattering, no TV murmuring late at night. The silence was almost oppressive, pressing against the walls that separated us. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it wasn't any of my business. Some people were just private, maybe even a bit reclusive. But that didn't stop my mind from wandering, especially late at night when the apartment felt too quiet. Then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it. I was brushing my teeth when a sound cut through the stillness, a muffled scream, distant and almost indistinct, but unmistakable. I froze, the toothbrush dangling from my lips, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. The sound seemed to come from Mr. Grayson's apartment. For a moment, I stood there, straining to listen, wondering if I had imagined it. But there it was again, another muffled cry, softer this time, almost as if someone was trying to keep it quiet. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a TV show, Mr. Grayson finally breaking his silence with some late-night drama. Or maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. I rinsed my mouth and shook my head, trying to dispel the unease creeping up my spine. It had to be the TV. What else could it be? But deep down, I didn't believe it. Something about that sound felt too real, too visceral to be a mere show. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, but sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept circling back to that scream, the eerie silence that followed it, and the strange stillness that seemed to envelop Mr. Grayson's apartment. I wanted to knock on his door, just to make sure everything was okay, but I didn't. What would I even say? "Hey, I heard something weird coming from your place. Are you all right?" It seemed ridiculous, intrusive even. Instead, I lay there in the dark, my ears straining for any other sounds, but none came. The night passed in silence, and by morning, the fear had dulled, fading into the background noise of my day-to-day life. But the memory of that scream stayed with me, lingering at the edges of my thoughts, like a shadow that refused to leave. I told myself it was nothing, just a momentary lapse, a product of an overactive imagination. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. The muffled scream from Mr. Grayson's apartment should have been a one-off, something that faded into the background like a bad dream. But it wasn't. Instead, it was just the beginning. The noises became a regular part of my nights. At first, it was just occasional, a faint cry here, a soft thud there. But soon, they grew more frequent and impossible to ignore. There were nights when I would be lying in bed, my eyes heavy with sleep, only to be jolted awake by the sound of scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. Other times, I could swear I heard whispered conversations, hushed voices that were too indistinct to make out but still sent chills down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was the pipes or some weird acoustics in the building that made sounds echo in strange ways. But every time I heard those muffled cries or those unnerving whispers, the knot in my stomach tightened. I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity, and frankly, my growing fear, started to get the better of me. I found myself lingering in the hallways, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Grayson or maybe hear something that would explain the noises. But he was as elusive as ever. His door was always slightly ajar, but I never saw him come or go. It was as if he had vanished, leaving only those disturbing sounds behind. I decided to ask my neighbors about him, hoping they might shed some light on the situation. But every time I brought up Mr. Grayson, the atmosphere changed. People became evasive, their smiles faltering as they quickly changed the subject. It was like they didn't want to talk about him, as if his name alone carried some unspoken weight. There was the elderly couple down the hall, the Millers, who had lived in the building for years. When I casually mentioned Mr. Grayson, Mrs. Miller's eyes widened, and she exchanged a quick glance with her husband. "Oh, we don't see him much," she said, her voice tight. "Keeps to himself, you know. Quiet fellow. Quiet. That word again." Everyone seemed to describe him the same way, but it didn't feel right. It felt like they were avoiding something, like they knew more than they were letting on. Then there was the single mother on the floor above me, Jessica, who I ran into in the laundry room. She hesitated when I mentioned Mr. Grayson, her hand pausing mid-fold as she considered her words. "I've heard things," she said finally, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear. "Weird noises. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but I don't know. Something's off with that guy." Her words echoed what I had been feeling, and they only made my unease grow. If others were noticing it too, then maybe I wasn't just imagining things. But what was really going on in that apartment? What was Mr. Grayson hiding? The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. The apartment that once felt like a haven now felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. I found myself constantly on edge, my ears straining for the next sound, the next clue that would confirm what I already feared, that something was terribly wrong. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the noises wouldn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding my attention. The whispers became clearer, almost like a conversation taking place just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, desperate, filled with a kind of fear that made my blood run cold. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit by and let this continue. But what could I do? Confront Mr. Grayson? Call the police? The thought of either made my heart race with anxiety. For now, all I could do was wait and watch, hoping that I was wrong, that there was some logical explanation. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was very, very wrong in that apartment, and I was the only one who seemed willing to face it. Fear and curiosity are a dangerous combination. They gnaw at you, slowly breaking down the walls of reason until you're left with no choice but to act. That's exactly where I found myself, caught between a growing dread and an insatiable need to know the truth. The more I thought about Mr. Grayson, the more questions I had. How could someone live in a place for over a decade and leave no trace of their existence? No visitors, no packages, no signs of life at all. It just didn't add up. So, I decided to dig deeper. I started with the building's maintenance records. I knew it was a long shot, but I needed to find out anything I could about him. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. Mr. Grayson had lived in that apartment for 12 years, longer than most of the other tenants. But there was nothing in the records about him. No complaints, no repairs requested, nothing. It was as if he lived in the shadows, unnoticed and unbothered. That wasn't the only thing that bothered me. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone else in the building was avoiding talking about him, like they knew something but were too scared to say it out loud. Every time I asked, they'd get that same uneasy look, mumble something vague, and then quickly change the subject. It was like there was an unspoken rule not to discuss Mr. Grayson, and I was the only one who hadn't gotten the memo. One night, the noises started again, louder this time, more desperate. It was the same muffled scream that had haunted my nights, but now it was accompanied by a frantic pounding, like someone banging on a wall or door. My heart raced as I lay in bed, my mind whirling with fear and questions. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to do something. I waited until the building was quiet, long after midnight when everyone else was asleep. Then, I quietly slipped out of my apartment, my hands trembling as I closed the door behind me. The hallway was dimly lit, the kind of darkness that seemed to close in on you, making the shadows stretch and shift. I hesitated in front of Mr. Grayson's door, my breath catching in my throat. The door was ajar, just like it always was. But this time, it felt different, more like an invitation or a warning. I didn't know which. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned closer, straining to hear any sound from inside. At first, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence that had always surrounded that apartment. But then, I heard it, a low, guttural moan, followed by a faint rustling, like someone or something moving inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run to the safety of my apartment and lock the door behind me. But I couldn't. My fear had turned into something else, something stronger, a need to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage I had, and slowly pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silent hallway. Inside, the apartment was dark, the only light coming from a flickering lamp in the corner of what looked like a living room. The air was thick with an unpleasant smell, something sour and musty that made my stomach churn. I stepped inside, my heart racing as I took in the surroundings. The apartment was sparse, almost barren. There were no personal touches, no photos or decorations, just a worn-out couch, a small table, and a few pieces of old furniture that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, as if the place had been abandoned long ago. But it wasn't abandoned. I could hear something, someone, moving deeper inside the apartment. The noise was faint but unmistakable, a soft, shuffling sound, followed by a low, almost imperceptible murmur. My feet moved before I could think, carrying me further into the apartment. I passed through the living room, my eyes darting around for any sign of Mr. Grayson. But the place felt empty, lifeless. It wasn't until I reached the hallway leading to the bedroom that I realized the noise was coming from there. I stopped in front of the closed bedroom door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. I had come this far, and there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, I grasped the doorknob and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness so thick it felt like a living thing. I stepped inside, the air growing colder, heavier. And then I saw it. A figure, hunched over, sitting on the edge of the bed, its back to me. The outline was unmistakable, Mr. Grayson. But something was wrong. His body was rigid, unnatural, like he was frozen in place. And that's when I noticed the source of the noise, the low murmur that had drawn me here. It was coming from him. I took a step closer, my breath catching in my throat as I leaned in to get a better look. And that's when the smell hit me, stronger this time, decay, rot, death. My stomach turned as the realization washed over me. Mr. Grayson wasn't sitting there. He was slumped over, lifeless. His skin, pale and waxy, clung to his bones, his eyes wide open but unseeing. And the murmuring sound? It wasn't coming from him. It was coming from something else, something in the room with us. Before I could process what was happening, the door behind me slammed shut, plunging the room into complete darkness. The low murmur grew louder, filling the space around me, and I realized with a sinking dread that I wasn't alone. Something was in there with me. The darkness in the room felt suffocating, pressing against me as I stumbled back from Mr. Grayson's lifeless body. The faint murmurs had grown louder, more frantic, and the oppressive smell of decay filled my senses. I knew I had to find out what was causing the noise. What else was lurking in this nightmare of an apartment? As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed how unervingly tidy the room was. Everything was in its place, meticulously arranged, as if it were a macabre showcase. But the cleanliness only highlighted the disturbing nature of the situation. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. I followed the sound of the muffled screams, now unmistakably human and filled with pain. They led me to a door on the far side of the room, a door that was not just closed but locked. My heart raced as I realized this must be where the screams were coming from. The door was old, the lock rusty but sturdy. I fumbled around for something to break it open, my hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. I found a heavy metal vase on a nearby shelf and used it to smash the lock. It gave way with a loud crack, and I pushed the door open, bracing myself for whatever lay beyond. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was small and sparse, but the sight of its occupant was the stuff of nightmares. In the corner, a woman was huddled, her body emaciated and covered in filth. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face gaunt and bruised. She looked up at me with a mixture of hope and disbelief as the door creaked open. Her condition was horrific. She had clearly been held captive for years, her limbs shackled to the wall with rusty chains. The stench of decay was even stronger in here, mingling with the acrid smell of fear and despair. I felt a surge of rage and determination. I had to get her out of this hellhole. But before I could move, I heard a sound behind me, heavy, deliberate footsteps. I spun around to see Mr. Grayson standing in the doorway of the room, his eyes dark and empty, his expression twisted into a grotesque mask of fury. "So you found my little secret," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "I should have known someone would eventually come poking around." His eyes flicked to the woman, and then back to me, filled with a manic gleam. "She's been mine for so long. Do you really think you can just take her away from me?" Panic surged through me. I had no idea how to handle this, how to confront someone so clearly unhinged. I glanced back at the woman, who was now sobbing quietly, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with a heartbreaking plea. Mr. Grayson stepped further into the room, his movements deliberate and menacing. "You shouldn't have come here. You don't understand what you're dealing with." I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon or a means of escape. There was a small window on the far side of the room, but it was too small for even me to fit through. I would have to find another way. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed the metal vase I had used earlier and hurled it at Mr. Grayson. He ducked, but the distraction was enough. I ran to the woman, quickly unlocking her chains with shaking hands. Mr. Grayson was already recovering from the surprise attack, his face contorted with rage. I could see the derangement in his eyes, the twisted obsession that had driven him to commit such atrocities. I had to get us both out of there, and I had to do it quickly. With the chains finally off, I helped the woman to her feet, supporting her as best as I could. The screams from earlier had turned into a cacophony of chaos, with Mr. Grayson shouting after us as we made our way to the door. Just as we were about to escape, Mr. Grayson lunged for us. I shoved the woman ahead of me, turning to face him with a mix of fear and resolve. We were so close to the door, but he was relentless, pushing us back. A fierce struggle ensued, but my determination to save the woman drove me forward. With a final burst of strength, I managed to push Mr. Grayson away and slam the door shut behind us. We stumbled into the hallway, my heart racing as I led the woman toward my apartment, away from the horror next door. We reached my apartment, and I quickly locked the door behind us, collapsing against it with a mix of relief and exhaustion. The woman was safe for now, but I knew the nightmare wasn't over. Mr. Grayson would not let this end easily, and I had to stay vigilant. The police arrived shortly after, alerted by my frantic call. They took Mr. Grayson into custody, and the woman was given the medical attention she desperately needed. The horror of what I had discovered was beyond anything I could have imagined, and the nightmare of living next to such a monster would haunt me for a long time. But as I watched the police take Mr. Grayson away, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The woman was free, and for now, that was enough.